Bem-vindos de novo. Estamos a encaminhar-nos para o segmento final deste dia, desta jornada, deste encontro sobre o Admirável Mundo Novo. Quando me foi colocada a questão de apresentar os próximos dois convidados, ainda perdi algum tempo a tentar encontrar uma forma original, mas achei que era demasiado arriscado e, portanto, vou-me limitar a algo de muito simples, que é uma pequena biografia de cada um deles e, antes disso, apenas uma frase de uma pessoa que já foi citada aqui várias vezes hoje e que me foi inspirada por uma das obras do Bruce Sterling, que é esta. Nós construímos as ferramentas, desenhamos as ferramentas e depois as ferramentas moldam-nos a nós. E há uma das obras de Bruce Sterling que tem a ver com esta ideia. É escritor, jornalista, crítico, autor de romances de ficção científica, entre os quais Holy Fire. Dedica-se à escrita de contos, artigos de opinião. Entre as obras de não-ficção, vou citar três: The Hacker Crackdown, Law and Disorder on the Electronic Frontier. Tomorrow Now, Envisioning the Next 50 Years. E a terceira obra, Shaping Things. Daí aquela frase. É redator convidado da revista Wired, para a qual escreve sobre política, globalização, tecnologia, participou em projetos de arte e cultura digitais. As suas opiniões e análises são citadas em toda a imprensa internacional. Welcome, Bruce Sterling. And welcome, Jake Bowers. Professor associado de Ciência Política e Estatística e investigador científico do Centro Nacional de Aplicações de Supercomputação, o NCSA, na Universidade de Illinois. Estudou Ética, Política e Economia na Universidade de Yale, Ciência Política na Universidade da Califórnia e Política de Saúde em pós-doutoramento na Universidade de Harvard. Nutre um interesse de longa data por teoria política, mas a sua paixão por ficção científica é ainda mais antiga. Jake Bowers leciona uma cadeira na Universidade de Illinois, que tem como objetivo melhorar a forma como os jovens encaram e definem as políticas do futuro. And as far as I know, Jake, welcome. You got a little bit thrilled when you get the invitation to have this talk.
Absolutely.
I think it's not really an interview, but it's some kind of dialogue between you and Bruce Sterling, because as far as I know, you've never met before.
No, not until yesterday.
So, this is a premiere.
Yes.
Let's do it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I should also say parabéns a todos for staying for so long. So, if you have somebody introduce somebody else, you know that somebody else is important. That's the point, right? Now, you already know he's important because he's also on a stage. And you already know about his awards, science fiction, nonfiction, and ongoing activities to influence design, and all of these amazing things from his Wikipedia page that was updated 7 days ago by Anonymous. One of you may be anonymous, in fact. But why I would pay close attention to Bruce now is not merely because other people say he's important or we're signaling importance here, but I'd invite you to listen now and read more later and look at all of his speeches that he gives, because he's really good at compellingly imagining how the present turns into the future. His futures persuade and grab attention because of his insight into the now and his creativity about tomorrow. I see you, Bruce, as a cultural critic and a kind of political theorist, maybe somebody who will shape how we make our trek to the 22nd century. So here's Bruce Sterling. Shall we give another applause? Okay, so part of today has been about noticing and understanding what's going on around us. And one thing that we haven't talked about, but I notice, are refugees and warlords, what you called the New World disorder. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how what does technology have to do with this?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic and one that I follow closely. You would think from the way people discuss surveillance or the military or invasions of privacy and so forth that the world was very rigidly controlled by computers, but in point of fact, there's large parts of the world right now which are just failed states. I mean, just strange areas. I mean, nobody's under more rigid surveillance than Afghanistan and Iraq, and they just don't behave at all. Silicon Valley is having a climate disaster. So, we often speak as if Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft were like huge and indestructible structures, but, they're in a part of the world where there just hasn't been much rain, and if there's no rain for another 5 years, there's not going to be a California. It'll be like Baja California. So, they suffer this kind of, physical threat and an instability that's underestimated. The Ukraine erupted. We've got kind of a new Cold War. There's warlords all over Ukraine. They're very canny in social media. In fact, the Ukrainian war broke out first on social media. Before anybody started shooting, there were flame wars between Russian-speaking ethnics and Ukrainian-speaking ethnics. And if you were following that, which I was, you could see that instead of an internet which is sort of bringing everybody together, this was an internet that was visibly dividing a society where people were really going to sort of take up weapons, and they did and still do. There's a decline in democratic institutions. Financial corruption has not been solved by the internet, quite the opposite. We've got tremendous income differentiation, which is getting worse and worse. And, I'd close this by saying that we're in an area for musicians, and this is a music hall. And musicians have not done very well by the internet. They've just been disrupted again and again and again, and there have been an infinite number, seemingly endless number of technical solutions for music, none of which make musicians any happier or make the music industry any stronger. And I often say that whatever happens to musicians will happen to everybody. So, that's why I watch musicians.
Yeah.
And, instead of envying them, I now pity them.
Right. Well, so one question I was having was about ISIS, and in particular, it seems like they're very active on social media, but I haven't been able to see the roots of ISIS in, we are talking as if technology is changing the world, right? But I mean, ISIS is changing the world as we speak, and ISIS just was one example.
Right.
I mean, do you see, these technological forces as contributing to the creation of ISIS, for example?
Yeah, I think ISIS is a direct descendant of the Arab Spring.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all that instability came from the Arab Spring originally, and it looked good, and in some areas it sort of kind of worked. Mm-hmm. They had a whole series of national revolutions. But in Syria, it went really very badly. And you can still see, the electronic aspects of that, like the Syrian Electronic Army is, although there aren't very many of them, they're one of the most serious cyber war outfits in the world. I mean, the Israelis are afraid of the Syrian Electronic Army. Mm-hmm. Even though they're an enemy of ISIS and so forth. And ISIS isn't particularly good at using social media, but they're very good at purging people by using social media. Mm-hmm. They'll just go and look in the town and see if somebody's been active on Facebook and just have him hauled out, mm-hmm. right? So you can remove internet activists from a society, and that actually damages the texture of civil discourse very strongly. And nobody thought of that at first. It's like, let's all go on Facebook and overthrow, people from Tahrir Square. They didn't realize that simply participating in Facebook could mark you for death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, one of the thoughts that I was having was also that there's an urge to decontextualize information when you have a lot of data, and this idea that the American military, went in for example, and fired the entire Iraqi military without thinking very hard. Because again, it's very easy. I mean, I'm doing a lot of machine learning myself. It's pretty amazing stuff. I can sit there, never before have social scientists been able to like recreate the truth. If you give me like a big data set and you hide the truth in it, I can find the truth.
Right.
I did that last week.
Yep.
Right? I feel super powerful. But like, you know, that's probably, I need some hubris or something. I mean,
Well, you know, knowing stuff and surveilling stuff and having it instrumented and having a big database on it isn't the same as the ability to take effective action.
right.
I mean, you can know that ISIS is all over the place. You can know the names of the top people in ISIS. That doesn't mean you can actually wipe them out.
Right.
And even if you do wipe them out, that doesn't mean you reestablish a civil society there. It just means you have a bunch of extra craters. You're just bombing the holes where there were holes where there were holes. You could say the same about the drug war. I mean, everybody knows who like the 80 richest guys in the world are. It's like, why don't we just go arrest all the oligarchs? I mean, there's only 80. Okay, the mere fact that we could like name and number them doesn't mean that we can actually upset the order that's established where they've got like huge tons of money. So, you know, I mean, you see this all the time. People get surveilled, and I mean, you could see it in journalism, that somebody has like done some misdeed, and there's like a tremendous howling in the press, and he just brazens it out. You know, it was exciting to be in Italy in the worst days of the Berlusconi scandals, because it was just obvious everywhere. I mean, literally everybody in every cafe was talking about Berlusconi's misdeeds, and the guy simply brazened it out. And it's like, think your worst of me, you know? Okay, fine, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, and people still vote for him, and he's still quite a popular politician.
Right.
It's different now.
Right. And of course, you know, we see in India, there's all these people who have criminal records who are being elected. Even though we have more transparency, they know they're felons and they're being
No, on the
elected.
contrary, people elect them because they are criminals.
Yeah, right.
You know,
That's true.
I mean, they're voting for the Godfather. They wouldn't want an honest guy. You know, he wouldn't be able to supply any. He wouldn't be able to bring home any cheese from
That's
Delhi.
right.
You know.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, people are voting. I mean, they know. You know. I mean, societies handle this a little bit differently. Like, I spent a lot of time in Serbia, which is a small and very conspiratorial state. So everybody's secret. Everything is secret, but everybody knows. It's like your cousin's in the secret police, and so everybody can, even the taxi driver can tell you who had so-and-so hit or why so-and-so was purged. Everybody's got a theory. Whereas in Italy, everything is very loud, but literally nobody knows what's going on.
Yeah.
You know, it's a huge carnival-esque situation, but they don't understand the wheels and levers in their own society.
Right. So when we have these states failing, like these Libyan refugees, I mean, Bruce and I had some discussions before this, and one thing that you said, which I really liked, which is that a lot of refugees is like a measurement, like that's a sign that your state is failing, right? So,
Right.
And we have more now than we've ever have since 1945.
Yeah, there's a lot. The population of Spain is basically on the move.
Right. And we have refugees upon refugees, right? You were saying Chechnyan refugees.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there have been people who've been uprooted several times and kind of chased from place to place.
Right, and it seems to be happening, right? We're looking for trends here. We're looking at trends in employment, the emptying out of the middle. We've been discussing these trends, but this is a big trend of, at the very least, movement of humans.
Right.
Because their states are somehow failing.
Bottom-up globalization.
Right, and it's not just like poor people. You know, we've always had poor people leaving places, but this is like disaster pushes people out.
Well, actually, they're lured out.
Okay.
You know, and a lot of refugees are not the poor people. I mean, the poor people leave when there's like a tsunami.
Okay.
So it's like physically unable to move. But if you're in like a politically troubled area or one where warlords are dominating, you actually deal with human smugglers. But you have a destination in mind, and it's generally some offshore area where you have social contacts. Okay. So if your cousin happens to live in Torino, which many do, you're willing to risk your life on the Mediterranean high seas now because you have an economic deal with the Libyan smugglers who are actually running the cigarette boats that go from one to the other. So you can be from Burkina Faso or Mali or Togo and do this like epic migration, knowing that you have a bed and probably a job if you don't drown.
Right.
And it's because they're connected electronically. It's not because they're getting, paper mail with a postage stamp. On the contrary, they're getting like WhatsApp.
Right.
Just kind of like hopefully pecking their way, across the Sahara, across the ocean. A fantastic spectacle. Worst thing in Europe right now. I mean, one of the worst. Right. When you have that kind of migration flow, it's like a sign of the wheels coming off. And there are a lot of those. I mean, there's 1 million refugees in Ukraine. Syria is worse than the Balkans by a long chalk. And, Libya is just like a mess. And I don't know. I mean, I'm no fan of the austerity either. I mean, there's a lot of out-migration from Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain.
Right.
And they all go somewhere. Right. They don't just go.
Right.
I mean, if you leave Portugal, you're going to Pittsburgh or, Canada or wherever it is you have contacts. And there's contacts are mostly electronic now.
Right. And so if you could, I guess one of the fears is that if like say the Libyans go to Tunisia, if you go from into a place where there's a weak state, then the refugees cause their own political crisis. But if they come to Italy, Turin is not going to essentially lose rule of law anytime soon.
Well, we hope not.
Okay.
But we did have, a massive out-migration, which is why Turin is a very interesting city to me. I mean, it was an Italian city which lost a third of its population from an economic collapse in the 70s. So we really had a very severe austerity. So in some ways, Torino is a post-austerity society and also like a post-automobile society. So, I do a lot of trend spotting there. Mm-hmm. And, I felt as soon as I arrived there that I was like looking at a place that was ahead of the curve in many ways. People often say that Turin is America's Detroit, but in many ways, Turin is actually, America's Turin and Detroit. If you switch the two, Turin is a success story, whereas Detroit is a failure.
What makes Turin a success story?
I actually think it's the sort of social solidarity in their society. They've got a kind of coziness between the politicians and the industry. So they're able to do things like throw in Olympics, or they can work up the political will to kind of build light rail and so forth. Okay. Whereas in Detroit, as the decline set in, it was kind of every man for himself. Mm-hmm. In Turin, they were kind of able to rally in some obscure way.
Right. Well, some of the most segregated census tracts in the United States are outside of Detroit, actually.
Well, Turin was desegregated by that because it now has a very polyglot society.
Okay.
Really a lot of foreigners in Turin, myself included. And, I live in the emigre area of Turin, and it's like a small New York in there. I mean, we've got Somalis, Bangladeshis, Chinese, Indians, South Americans of all descriptions, Arabs.
Right.
It's a fascinating study. I mean, it really looks very global, and I was there for a reason, really.
Do you feel like do you feel like the politics have been changing there? I mean, when we're moving away from the New World Disorder problem, but the New World Disorder produces brand new kinds of diversity that could be really enlivening and giving a lot of life to certain places. It seems to, students of American politics often say, look, we can never have social solidarity because of diversity. Is that going to be solved in Europe, or how do you see politics, evolving given these flows of population?
Well, I don't want to be all mystical about national character, but I think it's right to sort of say that the USA is just not going to go on social solidarity because it really just didn't. And in fact, there are very few New World societies that are into that. Mm-hmm. They just don't have that particular ethos. And, Italian politics is really interesting because it's just like very peculiar. And I like to compare it to Balkan politics because it's kind of, the Balkans are like a worst case Italy. Because Italy's very fractious. It's a long peninsula. And there's a lot of kind of personality cult politics in it. There are dozens of small political parties. Nobody's particularly attached to anyone. And, you would think that they would all be at one another's throats pretty soon. In the Renaissance, every Italian was knifing every other Italian. And there really is, an atmosphere of subdued violence there. And in the 1970s, there was a whole lot of political violence in Italy, which still very much mars the landscape. But you compare that to the Balkans, where periodically things erupt. I mean, they just really break into pieces. But oddly enough, things reunite in the Balkans too. I mean, there is a kind of strange solidarity in the Balkans, because they can't break. They break up and then they just sort of gather together, and then they break up again, and then they gather and then they break. And that's really a unique situation. I mean, I learned a lot from Belgrade. It's kind of not anywhere so sophisticated a society as Italy. They don't have the long, florid, metaphysical explanations that Italians will give you. But there's something invigorating, a place that has just hit rock bottom so many times. I mean, they're really great at emergencies. And if you think that we're heading for an era of emergency, that climate change would happen, that we're going to see big flows of refugees, that there's going to be splintered society, then the Balkans is a good model to look at. And they're not all bad. On the contrary, the quality of life in the Balkans is actually refreshing in many ways. It has a kind of vigor to it. It's a realistic and pragmatic society.
Do you see that climate change? I mean, you mentioned. Can you pursue that idea of splintering societies? I mean, do you think that climate change is going to lead to fragmentation in different places?
Well, it's going to lead to a lot of refugee flows.
Right.
And people stare when I say that California might be abandoned. But in living memory, we had a Dust Bowl in the United States, and everybody left Oklahoma. Everybody left Nebraska.
Right.
They just left.
Yeah.
There was no water, and people left. There wasn't any miracle cure when there's no water. When there's no water, people go. And there's no snow in California now.
Right.
So, they're not going to make water by pressing the F1 function key on their Android deck. If there's no water, they're going to be Baja California. And Baja California could not support Los Angeles. It couldn't support San Francisco. I mean, it's a very heavily populated area with a very frail, I mean, people ask how you run out of water, and the answer is slowly and then all at once.
Right.
And and that's like a scenario that would be super interesting should it happen. It's just Evgeny Morozov here was talking earlier, and he's why don't we have the Podemos version of a social medium? And I could explain what that would be. I mean, it would be like the French dirigiste Minitel. A Minitel is what he was hoping to have. But, let's just assume that everybody in Google, Amazon, Facebook are just, disrupted by a huge natural disaster. You might find Podemos actually has to make your hardware. And in that case, you'd be glad you'd listen to Evgeny. I was what if they're just gone? I mean, we are kind of reliant on them, and they have infiltrated every aspect of our society, and they do spy on us, and they are surveillance marketers, but they're still mortal and frail.
Right.
I mean, Minitel was frail. It lasted for a while. It had the full strength of the French state behind it, but, it went like that, and who remembers it? What happened to Nokia? Nokia was a huge company. There was Nokias in everybody's pockets all over the planet. 18 months they were gone.
Right. And the thing is that the climate is, I think Ellen Jorgensen was saying that, the climate doesn't care, the planet doesn't care, and we've seen this. I think in India is going to be, I'm most concerned about 50 years of abundant water as the glaciers melt, and then none in a place where,
people often ask me what the middle of the 21st century looks like, and I say it's old people in big cities afraid of the sky. That's what it's going to be like to be alive in 2040 or 2050, because the population will be older, cities will be bigger, and everybody will be afraid of the sky because the climate's been disrupted.
In India too?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. Okay. I mean, India is aging just like everybody else. And it has huge cities.
Okay.
And believe me, they'll be afraid of the sky.
Yeah.
They'll be plenty afraid of the sky. I mean, Indians are afraid of the sky every time the monsoon fails.
Right.
And, the monsoon is a dicey thing. So, I know it's dark to talk about this. It seems like, a very frightening situation, but, there is more resilience than people give credit for. And, there are areas of vast ecological disaster, like the Tigris and the Euphrates basin, which used to be, a beautiful blooming area. And people still live there. Millions of people live there. I mean, millions of people live in deserts. And we have millions of people who are really ingenious.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that California stays okay. They're just going to go back to Oklahoma and Nebraska, probably places with water.
Right.
But they could do it. It's not, this is not an apocalypse scenario. This is actually kind of a realistic assessment of the mid 21st century. And what really interests me is not even that, because that's obvious. I mean, I know it's big, old people in big cities afraid of the sky. What really interests me now is the 22nd century.
Right.
Now,
Yeah, and so that's one thing I was wondering about is, are we going to still have another assumption that we've seen here is of the nation state, right? I mean, there's the EU, but throughout everything we have the nation state, and I'm wondering about that. Well, about nation state surviving, or if there's going to be post-national.
Yeah, well,
Just your speculation.
this was a favorite topic. I mean, if you were into a science fiction writer in the 80s and 90s and you were writing about globalization, it was all about twilight of sovereignty and nations collapsing and being replaced by corporations. And they were not replaced by corporations. In fact, corporations aren't very powerful at all because there's no lifetime employment and there's very little brand loyalty. It's actually the ultra-wealthy, almost individual moguls and oligarchs who've turned out to dominate. It isn't corporations replacing states. But we do have things which are not states that are very powerful. And, like the market or, the finance markets. So let's just say that the nation of France had imposed austerity on Portugal. If a nation had done that to Portugal, it would have been an act of war, right? But if the market can do whatever it can, whatever it pleases to Portugal, and there's sort of very little in the way to fight back. Right. But they've certainly had more effect on Portuguese daily life than any other state. I mean, the market did things to Portugal that America didn't do, Russia didn't do, Spain wouldn't dream of harming Portugal in that way. But you were harmed by this non-state actor that we call the market, and there are others. There's kind of lots. So I made a little list of them here. Cool. Let me just see if I can find my handy group. Yeah, there's warlords, like the new Ukrainian social media warlords. There's guys like ISIS. There's offshore banks and kind of money laundries, which you've got to kind of have. There are operating systems, which are in everybody's pockets. That's like Google, Apple. And, there's Facebook, which has a bigger population than many states. There's ultra-wealthy individuals. You can see what they can do in London. You go to live in London now, there's a lot of expensive buildings with nobody inside them. Because, they want to retreat to London if they're chased out from where they are. But this is globalization at work. There are smart cities, which interest me a lot. Because, to have a smart nation is kind of difficult. Because it's just too big in scale to do a lot of these kinds of urban automation things. But, Barcelona as a smart city is quite interesting to me. Torino has a big smart city initiative. Vienna is doing smart city things. But they're all doing it in different ways. And, I see a lot of potential in that because it seems to me that cities are on the sort of proper scale to do some of these technical things. Trying to get them done nationally would be too cumbersome. And then, of course, there's the EU, which is, kind of an alliance of states and not really a state. And, these past couple of years have been the first time that anybody actually ever died for the EU. And they've died for individual states, but in Euromaidan, people were dying for the hope of being in Europe. And, it's the first, there's a new Cold War there, and it isn't even a U.S.-Russia Cold War. It's mostly an internal Ukrainian Cold War between Russophiles and Europhiles, and they started shooting each other, and it's over 6,000 dead. So, that's very interesting. It's sort of dyeing the European flag in blood. And every European flag is soaked in blood, but the European 12-starred flag did not have that, and now it does.
And so do you think I mean, going toward the 22nd century, you know, as a person reading a bunch of these science fiction books, you know, a lot of people imagine, you know, things like files, you know, things, this is in Neil Stephenson's Diamond Age, but the idea is
Right.
if you're ultra wealthy and your inequality is increasing, and it's increasing, by the way, not in the US, the marriages of the wealthy are stable, more stable now. The wealthy spend more time with their children. So the actual very family lives are different. Like we're having culturally different groups, right? And it would be so easy to say, my smart city is no longer part of this United States. We're a new file or something like that. Or it's the transnational, you know, we have a neighborhood in London, we have a neighborhood in Manhattan.
Right. Well, you know, H.G. Wells and Jack London used to write about class a lot. And they would write these sort of, you know, scientific romance novels. They're all about the iron heel of the, you know, of the capitalist oppressor crushing the, you know, the precariat and the proletariat and so forth. You know, I don't think that's actually happening. You know, the sort of ultra-wealthy we have now are this kind of new global oligarch class. And they do have really interesting lives. And, you know, they make sort of great characters in a thriller novel. But, you know, they're not particularly well organized themselves, and they don't really have a clique per se. And it's kind of easy to, like, join that class and just get pushed out of it.
Okay.
You know, you can be very wealthy and just end up throwing yourself off your yacht. They don't really have very stable lives, unlike the aristocracy where you were born into it and everything sort of worked out for you. If you're a Ukrainian oligarch right now, you're very wealthy but very, very scared.
Right, right. Well, I was also thinking about it from the perspective of you know, I was just thinking about the state of Kansas, which continually shows itself to be culturally distinctive.
Yeah.
You know, and if Kansas didn't have to, you know, I don't know, had bioreactors and solar panels, like if Kansas could get off the grid, I mean, it's basically trying to get off the grid. It doesn't want to be connected to a bunch of the country. Why not say, you know, make Kansas its own thing?
Well, we're talking domestic American politics
Sorry.
here, but, you know, Kansas is a state in the center of the United States. It's in the Midwest, and they used to have the reputation of being very stable, middle-class people, and now they're some of the most politically lunatic people in the United States are from Kansas. And, you know, and the Californians, by contrast, who everybody considered completely crazy, are much more mainstream and acceptable figures now. So it's been fun to watch that go around. I mean, I don't like to give other people in the United States political trouble because I'm from Texas, where our politics are just disastrous. But I could tell you that it gave me a sense of sympathy and solidarity for other people's politics. And if you're from Texas, it's very easy to understand Serbia. It's like heavily armed ethnic resentment. It's like, you know, they have their own Alamo, you know. Yeah. It's kind of, it's easy to sympathize in that way. And, you know, I actually learn a lot by that. I travel a lot, and it helps me find the real change drivers. People have their own names for them. They kind of put them in different order. But if it's a truly global phenomena, people kind of adopt it and, you know, learn to speak about it from their own way. So, you know, as I go from one place to another, I can weed out the things that don't matter, like Kansas being crazy.
Okay.
Only matters to people in Kansas, as opposed to things like what you do with your app collection, which sort of everybody seems to have, and like, you know, most of them are achieving some kind of consensus about it unless they're Chinese, which is why I take the Chinese super seriously.
Right, yeah.
You know, like Xiaomi and Huawei, they're on my alert list right now. You know, everything Xiaomi does, I study with great interest.
You can buy it in the United States now.
Oh yeah, they're in Europe.
And
they're
they're
in the U.S. Yes, they're sort of every single thing that Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft are not. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, it might be a bargain. It's like, okay, the Chinese Communist Party is spying on me. But that's better than having the NSA spy on me, because, you know, I know the Chinese can't actually reach me. They can't really do anything. Maybe it's actually a better bargain for me to just go ahead and, like, buy this Chinese stuff. You know, maybe it is a better bargain. I mean, I'm, like, tempted to give it a try. Or, you know, there's the open source movement, which I also take quite seriously now because, you know, the majors are taking it seriously. So, you're seeing like Microsoft is opening stuff and Apple is opening stuff. And it's just kind of this big collection of pretty effective software that kind of anybody can use. And, I'm always surprised that Europeans find so little interest in that. Like, and if I were Portugal and I wanted to upset everybody's apple cart, I would just pay to open source stuff. Like, I would do an open source version of Uber and just like give it away. Mm-hmm. And if Uber came and sued, I'd say, come on over to Lisbon. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what would their answer be? Portugal could buy Wikipedia. You couldn't buy them, but you could easily be their biggest patron. It would be like a line item out of your national budget. And imagine if you were the biggest patron of Wikipedia, how everybody would respect you. You'd be like right up there. Like, oh yes, Wikipedia brought to you by the nation of Portugal. Right? Suddenly you'd be, an internet superpower without really having to do much of anything, right? You'd have to persuade your legislation to pony up some money, but, why not do that? And it's really, you're not going to get the Evgeny Morozov version of the nationalist. You're not going to make the Portuguese cell phone, okay? It's just not going to work. But you could easily, contribute to the Android platform. Mm-hmm. It's just sort of sitting there, do your own fork of the thing.
Right.
Yeah, And it would really upset the apple cart quite a lot. You could punch way above your weight in a situation like that. It's kind of an Estonian solution. Estonia is a country about Portugal's size, and they're always doing odd electronic innovations of that kind that don't cost very much. Like, they'll give you the Estonian e-business passport.
They were one of the first e-voting, actually.
Yeah, well, you can't be an Estonian citizen, but you can just have the right to do business on the internet in Estonia, and they give you a piece of plastic. Mm-hmm. Why doesn't Portugal do that?
Well, one of my thoughts, actually, we're coming down toward the end, but, after we were listening to Evgeny, was thinking about these people here. And my instinct was to say that people should focus on learning how to do things with open source tools and learn about those things. Most of my students at Illinois don't. They have Macs and Windows. My students are political science students mostly.
Right. Well, its problem is that it all comes from the kind of personal computer ethos, where it's like me being Richard Stallman and trying to take on AT&T all by myself. And I think that's kind of silly. The biggest open source hardware project in the world belongs to Facebook. So, I'm not super interested in the kind of yeoman thing where I'm sitting at my personal computer, because I don't think they're going to be around very much longer. A genuinely personal computer that's just for you, that isn't hooked to the internet, is an anachronism. They're all social.
Yeah.
They're all social all the time. And the trend is toward more sociality in computer platforms, not the unique one where it's just you being the American cowboy taking on everybody because you can program.
Right.
That was always rubbish. One guy can't do everything, even in a science fiction movie. It's kind of ridiculous. So the time has come for stuff like state-supported open source, or even like EU open source, or city-supported open source, just stuff with some scale,
Right.
When you do a venture capital thing in California now and you launch a brand new company, it's very common to just drop $500 million on them, on a startup.
Right.
$500 million. Okay, that's real money. One guy being Mitch Kapor isn't going to have $500 million. But that's the scale of the computer industry we have now. And, Evgeny, and I love quoting the guy, follow him on Twitter, he's hilarious. He was talking about big pharma, big oil, and these other kinds of gigantic industries. And he was saying, and big data is like that. And my answer is yeah, it is. It's exactly like that. And we need to treat it exactly like that. Mm-hmm. Just go ahead and go with it.
Yeah.
And, I'm not discouraged by this. On the contrary, I see this. I know that an epic struggle is at hand. The Internet of Things is at hand, and these electronic entities are just kind of grab all the physical stuff they can. And why not? They're the leading industries of the age. Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, maybe Xiaomi, maybe Huawei. These are the major industries that we have. They're like the trains, they're like the railroads used to be. But the fact that they're consolidating now and that they tend to mimic each other so much is a sign of consolidation in the computer industry. And it means that someday it will be old-fashioned. And I can sort of see over the side of that. And when I talk about the 22nd century, I'm talking about a post-digital century. Just one where nobody's excited by networks. Nobody cares about cyberspace. Computers are boring. Social media is something your grandfather did, right? And, you know, and it gets you past this kind of singularity rhetoric of like, oh, we'll just push it farther and everything's going to explode. No, it isn't. It'll explode, but not in the way you expect. And the 22nd century is going to be another century. Just like the 20th, just like the 19th, like the 18th, it'll last 100 years. You know, if you have a daughter this year and she lives the normal European lifespan, she will reach the 22nd century. You can be alive today and be somebody who's living in the 22nd century. And just talking about it, I think, is it's an antidote to the mania that we've suffered during many years of an exceedingly exciting, just a frenzied technical development, a wonderful spectacle, a bigger deal than the atomic age, the space age. I was just thrilled to watch it. Of course, it's dark in some ways, but it's because we are. It's dark because we're humanizing it. It's no longer some kind of platonic abstraction. I mean, it's evil because there are evil people among us. It's good because there's some good in us. You know, it's taking on literary qualities now, political qualities.
Right.
You know, and we're just going to have to live with that. And we will live through it, and there will be something else. There will be something else we have no words for yet.
Well, on that note, I have to say we're done with our conversation. Thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you all.